international standards, auditing and quality assurance in the applied science field. Thanks, can you hear me? Well, thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you for coming along and battling traffic and parking issues. Ironically, I got stuck in traffic on the way here and I thought, this will be interesting as we go. So, as Alison said, I do have some qualifications, but my first and foremost qualification is as a mum. I'm a mum of an asthmatic, quite a severe asthmatic. We live at the moment in the Narrabeen area. And just to give you a little bit of background about how this all started, I went along faithfully to a PNC meeting at the beginning of this year, and the PNC president had been asked by several parents, what are all these tunnels about? How are they going to impact our kids? Our kids have to come across the River Expressway to get to school. That's our catchment. What's going on? And unfortunately, I said, I'll have a look into it. And I thought, actually, I'm sure we'll find, my perception, like yours, was, look, we're going to hop on and be able to get to the beach. Great, awesome, that gets rid of the traffic. We've got relatives on the beach. We're going to get some of this traffic off our roads. Surely it's not going to be for a long period of time. There might be some short-term impacts, and then we'll get through that and we'll actually see a whole lot of benefit. Sadly, as we started to look into the projects, we realised through a number of methods that wasn't quite the case. So we set about, with a group of parents with various technical backgrounds, we came together and we started to do an audit process, like I would have done in Standards Australia. We went through a process of actually a document review, a technical review. We interviewed different specialists in various fields, about 12 different specialists in various fields. We're still interviewing them. We also went to the RMS sessions, spoke to the RMS. We've also gone and met with Gladys Berejiklian to actually understand her view on the projects. So we've done a fairly substantial review of the RMS documentation and independent specialists and experts' information. What we need to understand is that the first lot of documents that were produced were the scoping documents. Those scoping documents do have risks actually listed in those documents. So a lot of what I'm going to present tonight is actually based on RMS's own documents. The thing is now we've now gone into what's called the reference design stage, which are probably the more glossy brochures that you've seen with the smaller maps. They don't have a high level of detail. It's very hard as a community for us to give feedback because those documents are quite abbreviated. So we've actually joined the two things up. We don't have what's going to come out in the next stage, which is called the EIS, the Environmental Impact Assessment. We don't have that yet. So as a community, we're being asked to give feedback on something that we actually don't have all the technical information on. That's why we've gone about this process. So I'm also aware that there's people here that may know a lot and people that may know not much about the projects. This is what's proposed. The dark blue line is the Western Harbour Tunnel. The lightish blue line here that runs from Milsons Point up to Narrabeen is what's called the Warringah Expressway upgrade, and there's various aspects of that upgrade that are going to take place. So there'll be lane changes and the ports need to go into the expressway. There is some widening, and speaking to the RMS last week, it's probably along there that we're going to see acquisitions and things because of the need to widen at certain points. We don't know where those are going to be as yet. The orange line is the Northern Beaches Tunnel. So what you can see there, well, you might be able to see, one thing that I'll note is that there's a little Artarmon extension that then joins up to the M2. The Northern Beaches Tunnel goes over and finishes in Balgowlah, so we don't see the beach anywhere in sight. So it's really connecting into the Balgowlah area there. So what we did, we wanted to have a look more closely at our area, so we redrew the maps on Google Maps. We also put in the metro line, which I think will be of a lot of interest in the North Sydney area because these projects are actually happening at the same time. There's been a lot in the media about overdevelopment at the moment. You've got the tunnel projects proposed, the metro project is being tunnelled, but you've also got a lot of building works and other things that are going on in the North Sydney area as well. So the dark blue line, which is the Western Harbour Tunnel, actually finishes at that junction just outside Anzac Park, and the Northern Beaches Tunnel starts there. So you've got 4 ports going in there. We've got 2 ports going in. Each tunnel is a twin tunnel, by the way, as well. 2 ports going in up at Artarmon, and then we haven't extended it. Sorry if anyone's from Bargalla, but you've also obviously got exit ports in Bargalla as well. This, just where that North Bridge sign there, that's Flat Rock Gully. That's where the main temporary construction site is going to be. So they're going to actually go from the surface there down and dig through in 3 directions. So up towards North Bridge, back towards Artarmon, and back towards Camaray. So that's scope. You've also got obviously down here at Waverton, just under the coal loader there, that's where the harbour crossing is going to take place from there. So you've got major construction work happening there as well. So what I'm going to do is actually just talk through some of the risks that we identified and explored. I can't go through them all tonight, I'll get pinged by Alison. These are the top 10 things that we found to be an issue. Now, most of those things were concentrated in our Camaray Narrabeen catchment, because that's where our children come from, but can be applied along the route really. So we looked at these things and the degree, I guess, of risk to our community. So this was the map we then came up with, and it does look like a bit of a mess. But what we did was we put all the schools and preschools, what the government calls sensitive receivers, so they're people and maybe businesses that may be very sensitive to a construction project for various reasons. You can see firstly that schools and preschools really do follow the route of the proposed construction. We have a very high density, the highest density of schools and preschools in Sydney on the North Shore. So there's 20 schools and 30 preschools that we've identified that will be impacted in one way or another. We also put on major playing fields. We looked at where the hospitals were, and then we looked at these red areas are potential contamination zones where there's like a source of contamination, and I'll come back to that. The yellow, we started to actually circle around every construction site, and basically they all just joined up. So we sort of did a generalised yellow section, but that represents possible noise impacts or vibration impacts or dust impacts. There's all sorts of construction type impacts. And the circles are the dispersion zones for the stacks once they're in, so pollution. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of research here. I'm bringing together other people's information, so I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on every single thing, but I've got permission to use other expert slides. So Noel Childs is a tunnel engineer and an expert in ventilation and filtration of tunnels. So he identifies risks in terms of air quality both during construction and then in operation. So obviously during construction there's air quality impacts due to increased vehicle movement, dust, contaminated sites, which I'll come back to. In operation you've got the internal air quality issues, you've got stack emissions, you've got the possible removal of traffic from the surface, you've got background levels that are already in existence and how we monitor. So there's quite a bit with regards to air quality there. So there's internal and external pollutants of concern, and I think sometimes we think of air pollution as just, I don't know, one molecule that floats around in the air. We've got masses of different pollutants that can actually cause harm. Alison referred to these very tiny particles which are called PM2.5, which are a big concern in scientific literature at the moment and research. So tunnels can be one other thing. I'm just very quickly pointing on a few things. One confusion that I've come across when people have spoken to me is they say, isn't ventilation filtration? No, ventilation is just the movement of the air and how it's ventilated, how we move air and disperse air through the tunnels and out of the tunnel. It doesn't mean that it's filtered. There's 2 types of ventilation choices, and there are what Noel has called air cleaning. So it's not just filtration that can actually take these pollutants out of the air, there's other methods of doing that. So the 2 ventilation options are longitudinal or transverse. So longitudinal basically moves the air along with the flow of the traffic. So we've got a long tunnel, say from North Bargalla coming into Camaray, and one going from Rozelle all the way into Camaray. So what will happen is the pollutants that are produced by the cars will just be moved along with the flow of the traffic and then taken out by the stack. That's longitudinal. Transverse actually takes out the pollutants along the way using other methods. I'll go into the whole thing. There are air treatment options that are used throughout the world. There's electrostatic precipitators and active carbon and all sorts of technologies that are continually being used and grown to deal with pollution. So one thing, this will all come together for you in a minute, but one thing we need to understand is that around the world, and what Alison said is true, that we cannot find, and the experts we've spoken to cannot find comparable tunnels to these tunnels that are being built with WestConnex and the North Beaches tunnels at the moment. So when we say comparable tunnels from a scientific perspective, we usually look for benchmarks and for comparisons that are the same. So we're looking at the length of the tunnel, the type of ventilation that's being used, the traffic that's being allowed into it. We can't find one to compare to, so the only comparisons we've got is to what's already being built in Sydney. What's already being built in Sydney are much, much shorter tunnels. So you don't have to be scientists to work out that a shorter tunnel means less gathering of the pollution, particularly if you've got the transverse ventilation going on. So we looked at the international experience. There's places like Spain, Japan, and also there's a tunnel being built in Hong Kong that do treat the air in the tunnels. What's being proposed with these tunnels is no air treatment. The pollution will run along and be supported by some fans. So that 7.5 kilometres of pollution for us comes out at Cambrai from 2 tunnels. So it's 7.5 and 7 kilometres of pollution all come out in that one spot. So what Noel says is, why is it a problem? Well, it's ventilation, it's not filtration, just to be clear about that. Pollution is dispersed to the ground, and I think there's a perception that it just floats above Sydney. One of my friends said, does it go out through the ozone layer? Is that what it's for, the hole in the ozone layer? No. We have certain weather conditions, which actually, because we're actually on the water here, and we have this ridge line of the Blue Mountains, we're in this sort of gully, we do have weather conditions which actually push down that pollution onto the population, so we need to not think that it just stays up there and disappears. Risks do increase with the concentration. There's concerns from key government agencies, and we saw that yesterday in the WestConnex inquiry. With the EIS stage of the WestConnex, both the Health Department and the Environmental Protection Authority put in queries into the environmental impact assessment stage with planning and said there's not enough information. And regardless of that happening, the project still got approved. Now through then the next stages, once the project starts, they've got to try and address those things. But we would argue, and what the inquiry is arguing is, once the project starts, you can't actually make wholesale change and say, actually putting that right next to a school is not a good idea. What you've got to do is then risk mitigate what you're doing. And the health departments and the EPA, we'd expect, I think, as a parent group, that they get the information they need to make an adequate assessment before the project's approved. So we know that diesel emissions are carcinogenic. Health outcomes are not well researched around these tunnel stacks. And there's evidence that the PM2.5 molecules are harmful at any concentration. And this is emerging and growing body of research. And like all science, things do change as research comes out. What we may have thought in the past was spreading out pollution and lowering the concentration was okay. There are multiple bodies, including the World Health Organization, saying that PM2.5 is harmful at any concentration. So just to make that clear, Dr. Rayner says, slides, so this is just how tiny a PM2.5 molecule, those little pink molecules, that's a human hair, and that's how small we're talking these molecules are. These molecules can come not just from the fuel source, they come from the road surface, the tyres, the brakes. There's so if you have a car on the road, you are going to be producing some of these pollutants regardless of whether you change the fuel source. So the reason why these tiny molecules are so dangerous is actually the human lungs aren't designed to deal with them. So they're able to actually pass through into the circulatory system. And just like Raina said, has about 40 slides that he goes through. So if you're really interested in this area, go onto YouTube and have a look at his presentation. But This is extremely well researched. This is from the Royal College of Physicians. So these particles and car pollution causes things like low birth weight, premature birth, in young children, cough, wheezing, developmental problems, asthma, lack of lung function or growth of lungs, all those sorts of things in children. And just to really make it clear how dangerous pollution is for us, this is actually a lung cell of a child, and those black dots are the pollution particles we're talking about. The body needs to do something with these particles. So we're talking, and there's scientists out there that have called these PM2.5 particles the new asbestos. So we are really understanding that these things are very dangerous for us and that we really need to take note. So Ray Nasser talks about asthma, stroke, heart disease, cancer, respiratory illness, I'm sorry if I'm depressing you, cardiovascular disease, obesity, premature labour and low birth weight, and I had a child that was born prematurely, so I know just how difficult that is, and even Alzheimer's disease and other, there's some research lately that's come out about other mental functions and things like that as well. It's not just a health issue, it's a financial issue. It actually costs Australia $2.4 billion to treat the effects of air pollution health impacts. So Professor Paul Turizzo, Executive Clinical Director of the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney and a specialist in respiratory health, says there's overwhelming international evidence now from organisations like WHO that shows that sort of pollution, so road pollution, if you look at what happens across big cities, it increases the number of heart attacks people have, strokes, it increases deaths from heart disease, deaths from respiratory disease, and there is some new evidence in the most recent WHO publication which says it probably impairs lung growth in children and makes a contribution to diabetes. So these things on a population basis have a big impact on health. And there's other quotes there. So we have no doubts about the impacts of pollution. I think a few of the arguments are that pollution from stacks, we've discussed that, it does come down. There's a whole branch of science, engineering science, that actually works out with a ground strike, and we'd expect in the EIS to see that ground strike modelling. Having said that, all the research we've read also puts a warning on it saying it's very hard to, especially in foreshore areas, it's very, very hard to predict. So we know from government reports that on average it's 1.2 kilometres, but I can't guarantee you that the pollution is going to stay within that nice neat field of dispersion. There is an idea that pollution can be removed from local roads and then put into the tunnel, and it's condensed in one location rather than spread out over a wider location. Unfortunately, that was the theory of the Lane Cove Tunnel, and what the actuality was that the local road running increased to get to the tunnel, so there was no net change in the surface road traffic and the surface road pollution. I think also there's one point there, just that in terms of our choices taken away, as a mother of an asthmatic, I wouldn't choose to live next to a 6-lane expressway, and this is what this project is, a 6-lane expressway. I would move further away, knowing that pollution travels from surface roads around 200 to maybe 300 metres. With this, we're spreading out this pollution across 1.2 kilometres, across hospitals, across schools, across preschools that haven't chosen to take that risk, across sensitive receivers. So as Alison alluded to, this is the Linfield Air Quality Monitoring Station that says it doesn't comply with Australian standards. So it doesn't give us a high level of confidence, because I think a lot of people put confidence then in, okay, we'll put them in there, we'll monitor it. There's a lot of problems with the monitoring that have come out of WestConnex and that we're even seeing with our own data. We've asked for the background data from the RMS. They don't know what it is yet. So we find that very difficult, that they're actually justifying a project and a line on a map and saying, well, the background levels, it won't change that much, but we don't know what the background levels are. So I think that there's a bit of a gap there. There's also evidence, this is in May this year, there's a claim that we in Australia Sydney have low pollution levels. That's been measured on the outskirts of Sydney, and the World Health Organisation says don't compare cities in their data, because many cities measure their pollution in congested areas and we don't yet. RMS are comparing Sydney's data. to other cities. So we can see these is what is called exceedances. So you can see anything above the yellow line here is an exceedance over the standard, and that is a real worry for kids and for people with respiratory illness. That can cause very real health impacts. And also, these are temporary monitoring stations from the West Connects. You might have heard about Haberfield area, and you can see these spikes. So the 50 micrograms here is the per cubic metre is the maximum allowable average for particulate pollution. So you can see just how much we're exceeding that. So there are lots of questions over our monitoring, and also are we actually producing a fair level of pollution or a healthy level of pollution. Hasn't this all been tested before? I expected to find that when we looked into it. Yes, there was a research around the M5 stack, and it's unfiltered stack, and there was research around unfiltered Langpo tunnel stack. I expected when we actually looked at the scientific literature and the follow-up of that, we would see a very clear finding that there were no health impacts. That's not the case. And even speaking to the air quality guide for the RMS, there are health impacts that were found in both those locations. What they couldn't do was relate it to the monitoring data from the stack. So people had health impacts, so there was cancer cluster in M5, but the monitoring data didn't prove that it was because of the stack. So we've then gone forward and said, oh, well, it's not the stack, it's healthy, it's okay. But actually, when we look at the health research, that evidence isn't there.
Ding ding.
Thank you. So we're going to go forward. So there's contamination risk. So I think this is something that you might be interested in. This is what dredging and cofferdams look like. So that's what's going to go in down across the harbour for the harbour crossing, and also at Middle Harbour. That's not very good. So just to very quickly explain that, there's a few options. You can go under, you can go over with a bridge, you can go through. What's been proposed is an immersed tube that's going to go through both harbours, and that involves dredging. And there's certain risk mitigations you can put in with silk curtains, but when you've got chemical contamination from an industrial past, this is an old BP site area down at Waverton here, it's an old coal site. At Middle Harbour we've got an old quarry and an old landfill site. From a chemical contamination point of view, there is risk, and that is documented in their scoping documents. We know as we come to the foreshores, there's catchments, there's water flow going down to the harbour. We've got a very old area that we populated here in Flat Rock. It's an old landfill site. Disturbing that has all sorts of health and environmental consequences. So just in terms of construction, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about that in a minute, this is a very real picture from Pauline Lockie's experience over in the inner west of what happened when the diggers and everything moved in, and we'd expect a certain amount of that to happen. But this is, if you look at the inquiry footage, this is something that has been happening again and again over years and years and years. The noise impacts, the asbestos removal, again with old buildings. You can see no hazmat suit. The residents had to say, can you please put on a banner? We don't have a high level of confidence based on what we've seen happen over in West Connects that things are going to be managed differently. Here we haven't been given. We actually asked our RMS, what have you learnt? And we didn't feel like we got a very clear response about what they'd learnt from what had happened over there. Residents were given foam earplugs when there'd been literally weeks and weeks and nights of sleeplessness. And there's obviously the cofferdams are big steel structures that go in. If you're living down those areas, it's going to be extremely noisy. And also just the trucks around the area. They were talking about 70 trucks both ways from each port site. So that's 70 trucks per hour, per hour on the roads, double articulated trucks. And if you're anywhere in that sort of Cameron area or even here, the asbestos from the tip side will come through the Ringarooma Expressway, and they're saying it's going to go across the bridge. So we're going to have 70 trucks an hour full of contaminated material. So lots of green space, sorry, I've been ding-dinged. There's underground water everywhere, there's drawdown when tunnels go through. It's not just about vibration, it's actually about what constitutes the ground underneath as the tunnels come through. The water and the water tables change, so there's possible property damage You might have heard about St Peter's had weeks and weeks of odour to the point where whole suburbs had to move out of their homes, particularly children who had asthma. There's trapped decomposition under the ground. And obviously we've got little pockets around of natural and Aboriginal heritage that we want to protect. We've populated this area probably more than we need to, and we are at the point where we've got these little pockets of foreshore area that really should be protected for future generations. And these sorts of really large projects with that many trucks and that much spoil coming out of the ground will have an impact in those areas. You can see again, air pollution also is a problem during construction with the truck movements, the dust, the spoil that's coming out of the ground. This is again real data from St Peter's Public School Monitor. So over that line is where it's too high, and that was during the construction period, and the first clip was when they opened up the tip. So sensitive receivers, come back to that. I guess that's our main concern, is that if we've got children and hospitals and people that can't deal with all of this stuff, what is the benefit of doing it here? Does it make sense to follow this route and take these risks? And what are we actually achieving out of this? And this is what we're going to talk about next, is why the roads are being built. Do they actually provide the benefit? And when we look at cost, I find it very hard as a mum of an asthmatic to put my daughter up as collateral against a benefit. That I find really difficult. But if we're going to talk cost benefits, then what are the cost benefits? This is actually a quote from a government report, and it says that a tunnel represents a redistribution of pollutants, generally reducing concentrations over a large area while increasing concentrations in a small area around point sources. We are the point sources. Is that a reasonable risk to take in amongst 20 schools and 30 preschools and 3 major hospitals? So that was a close-up of where we're going to be. So if you're from St Mary's, you've got North City Dem here, you've got Western Harbour Tunnel, and I think St Mary's there, so I couldn't get the label to go. But these are all the schools in those dispersion zones, and it's not just that, especially in this area, the amount of on and off shallow ramps that you're going to be dealing with tunnelling and traffic and trucks is quite substantial. So, yeah, why choose this route? Is it the solution for Sydney? Is it the solution for our area? So we might come back to what you could do about it, because we're going to get Matt up now to talk about all of the justifications and the planning that went into this.